Behind locked doors, screams were swallowed by stone, and the darkest inventions of cruelty were kept hidden from the crowd. Torture chambers were not simply rooms of punishment, they were laboratories of fear. While some methods like burning at the stake or the wheel were made public as examples, others remained hidden, used in shadows, whispered of but rarely described. These were the secrets no empire wanted known, devices and rituals designed not only to kill but to erase, humiliate, and terrify in silence. Among the devices whispered about but rarely shown to the public, none carried more dread than the spiked coffins and so-called iron virgins. They were not designed for quick death, nor even to shock in the marketplace. These were punishments meant for silence, carried out in chambers where only the condemned, the torturer, and the echo of screams bore witness. The coffin was shaped crudely to fit the human form. Inside its hollow frame, iron spikes jutted from every surface. They were not long enough to pierce straight through the body and kill instantly. Instead, they pricked, tore, and pressed into flesh at dozens of points when the victim was forced inside. As the heavy lid swung shut, the prisoner felt cold metal slide across skin, points sinking just deep enough to bleed, but not deep enough to grant release. The pressure was unbearable. Every movement caused spikes to dig further, puncturing muscle, splitting skin. Air was scarce inside. With the lid closed, the chamber became a stifling tomb. Breathing itself scraped the body against metal. Victims tried not to move, tried to remain rigid, but cramps soon set in. A twitch of the arm, a shift of the leg, and new punctures opened. Blood trickled downward, pooling at the feet, mingling with sweat. The body weakened, the lungs gasped, and the sound of muffled cries thudded against the iron walls. Some of these devices were shaped like sarcophagi, others like statues. Chroniclers describe coffins carved into the figure of a woman, her arms open as if in embrace, what later storytellers called the Iron Maiden. The image was deliberate mockery, the promise of comfort turned into a death grip. Victims pressed inside found their faces scraped by spikes, positioned at eye level, their chests pressed against sharpened points that pierced but did not slay. The design was not to kill swiftly, but to keep them upright, bleeding slowly, suffocating in their own stench. Witnesses rarely saw the inside of these punishments. Most executions were public, burnings, hangings, wheelings meant to display power. But the spiked coffins were hidden in stone vaults, used when confession was needed, or when rulers wished a man erased quietly. The secrecy made them more terrifying. Rumors spread that prisoners screamed for days before their voices failed, that guards heard scratching inside long after the condemned should have died, that when the lid was finally opened, what remained was more blood than body. The psychological weight was as heavy as the iron itself. To know one was not only condemned but sealed away, unseen and unheard, was a torment as sharp as the spikes. In some accounts, victims begged not for mercy but for witnesses, for someone, anyone, to see them as they were unmade. But the chamber allowed no such comfort. The coffin closed, the key turned, and darkness did the rest. For rulers, these devices had symbolic power. They stood as threats whispered rather than shown, punishments more feared because they were hidden. Unlike the wheel in the square, the coffin left no spectacle, no ashes scattered on the wind. It left only silence, and silence can be more terrifying than fire. Among the darkest instruments of the chamber stood a seat that mocked the very idea of rest. The chair of blades. At a glance, it resembled a throne, but instead of velvet and ornament, its surface bristled with hundreds of iron spikes. Backrest, armrests, seat, even the footstool. Every surface was embedded with sharpened points, angled to pierce skin the moment a body was lowered into place. The condemned was stripped and bound, forced to sit naked against the iron. Immediately, the spikes tore into flesh, puncturing thighs, buttocks, and back. Blood welled from dozens of wounds at once, dripping down the legs to pool beneath the chair. Any attempt to shift only deepened the punctures. Even a shallow breath pressed the ribs against spikes, driven into the backrest. The body was trapped in stillness, and stillness itself became agony. Chains secured wrists to the armrests, ankles to the base. There was no relief, no position in which the pain dulled. As minutes stretched into hours, the wounds swelled, flesh inflaming around the spikes. Infection began at once. The iron, never cleaned, carried filth from countless victims before. The skin reddened, pus gathered, and the pain became a burning throb that pulsed with each heartbeat. Executioners rarely left the victim to simple piercing. Fires were lit beneath the chair, the rising heat turning the iron hot enough to scorch. First came blisters, forming where skin touched spikes. Then came the smell, a sharp, nauseating stench of flesh cooking on metal. Prisoners shrieked and twisted, but every movement dug the blades deeper. Those who fainted were revived with water or blows, dragged back into awareness so the ordeal could continue. The torment was not only physical, but psychological. Victims sat upright, their bodies locked in parody of dignity, as if enthroned in suffering. To witnesses, the sight was unbearable. A man who appeared seated in calm, yet every twitch of his muscles betrayed agony. Chroniclers wrote of eyes rolling back in sockets, mouths open in soundless screams when voices gave out. For onlookers, the horror lay not only in the screams, but in the silence that followed, when the chair seemed to consume a body slowly, point by point. Some were left to die over days, dehydration and infection compounding the torment. Others were granted a swifter end, throats cut or blows delivered once the crowd had absorbed enough terror. But the chair itself lingered in memory. Guards who carried it from chamber to chamber swore it seemed to hum when touched, as though the iron had absorbed the cries of all who sat upon it. Unlike the wheel or the stake, the chair of blades was seldom displayed in open squares. It belonged to the darkness, a secret instrument of confession and punishment. To rulers, it was a tool that spoke without being seen. To prisoners, it was the final seat from which no one rose. Not all torments of the chamber required elaborate ironwork. Sometimes the simplest tools, a rope, a dark corner, or the smallest of animals, proved more destructive than spikes or fire. In the silence of the dungeon, rats and ropes became instruments as precise and cruel as any device forged by blacksmiths. The use of rats was primitive but terrifying. A prisoner was bound flat on his back, his arms and legs stretched tight with cords until joints strained. An iron bucket, open at one end, was pressed against his bare stomach or chest, and inside the bucket a starved rat writhed. Hot coals were placed on top, and as the metal heated, the animal panicked. Trapped with no escape but forward, it clawed and chewed through the only path available, into the flesh of the living man beneath it. The scratching quickly became tearing. Nails raked skin, teeth gnawed muscle, blood spread beneath the rim of the bucket. Victims bucked against their bindings, screaming until their voices cracked, but the cords held fast. Witnesses described men convulsing so violently that their shoulders dislocated, the sound of bone popping swallowed by shrieks and the frantic squeals of the rat itself. Guards, hardened by routine, sometimes turned their heads away, unable to watch as vermin tunneled through human bodies. Ropes, too, were turned into engines of destruction. Prisoners were bound so tightly that circulation stopped, hands ballooning into grotesque shapes, purple and black. In some cases, cords were twisted with sticks, tightened gradually until bones cracked beneath the skin. Fingers split open, ankles snapped, jaws dislocated. The pain was slow and relentless, each turn of the stick another step toward permanent mutilation. Victims begged not for freedom, but for limbs to be cut away to end the torment. Darkness deepened these methods. The chamber offered no light, no escape from the scuttling sound of rats that crept in once torments were done. Those left bound overnight felt tiny claws tracing their wounds, teeth nibbling where flesh had already been torn. Sleep was impossible. Even the bravest broke into sobs when the scratching began, whispering prayers that dissolved into hysteria as vermin chewed at sores, lips or eyelids. What made these punishments so feared was their intimacy. Fire and iron disfigured openly, but rats and ropes attacked from within, slowly dismantling body and mind. The condemned could feel their humanity slipping with every bite, every snap of tendon. To those forced to watch, the horror lay in the ordinariness of it, nothing but a rope and an animal. yet enough to reduce a man to madness. Chroniclers noted that after such torments, victims were often left alive, broken, scarred, terrified of shadows. The punishment did not need to kill. Survival itself was the sentence, carrying the memory of claws and cords into every moment that followed. In the silence of the chamber, the simplest tools proved the most haunting. Rats gnawed flesh, ropes crushed bones, and darkness whispered the rest. If fire burned away flesh and iron tore skin, water attacked what no man could survive without: breath. In the hidden chambers of medieval dungeons, water was transformed from a source of life into a weapon of slow suffocation. Unlike the wheel or the stake, it left almost no visible trace. That invisibility made it especially feared, for the agony it inflicted could not be displayed on a scaffold, only felt in the lungs of the condemned. The most common form was the water cure. Prisoners were strapped down on wooden benches, heads tilted back at an unnatural angle. Executioners forced open their jaws with iron prongs or blocks of wood, then poured jug after jug of water down their throats. At first the victim coughed and sputtered, trying to turn his head, but the bindings held. The lungs filled with liquid, the stomach bloated painfully, and every attempt to expel the flood was met with another stream. The sensation was one of drowning, not once, but again and again, each cycle broken only by the frantic heaving of the body trying to survive. Those who fainted were revived quickly. Guards threw cold water on their faces, or struck them across the chest until consciousness returned. The torture had to be endured fully. Mercy had no place here. The condemned gasped, begged, and writhed, but every plea dissolved into choking. Some vomited water mixed with blood, their bodies convulsing violently, only for the jug to be lifted again. Time ceased to exist. Every second was reduced to a single need, air that was denied with ruthless patience. Another variation was dunking. Bound into wooden chairs or cages, victims were plunged headfirst into wells, rivers, or barrels of stagnant water. They thrashed beneath the surface, bubbles breaking in frantic streams, before being yanked up at the brink of unconsciousness. Witnesses described eyes wide with terror, mouths gasping like fish on land. Before a breath could fully return, the prisoners were plunged again. Each immersion stretched panic into despair, until the will to resist was broken. The psychological torment was as destructive as the physical. Prisoners began to sob before the water even touched them, knowing what was coming. Some confessed immediately, desperate to avoid another plunge, but confessions mattered little. The ordeal itself was the point. Priests declared that the act was cleansing, a forced baptism that purged sin through suffering. Yet those who watched saw no holiness. They saw men transformed into animals, thrashing, gagging, and sobbing, stripped of all dignity as water stole their voices. The aftermath was rarely visible to outsiders. Victims often survived the ordeal, their bodies left without scars, but inside, their lungs were damaged, their stomachs torn, their throats raw. Many died days later from fever or internal bleeding. Others lived but carried permanent terror, unable to drink without shaking, unable to hear water poured without reliving the suffocation. Guards spoke of men who clawed at their own throats in their sleep, convinced they were drowning again. Unlike the public execution, the water ordeal was not about spectacle. It was about secrecy, control, and silence. Nothing remained but the memory of choking, a memory that outlasted wounds and haunted every breath that followed. In this way, water proved itself more terrible than iron or flame, invisible, unforgettable, and mercilessly patient. Not every prisoner needed iron spikes, fire, or ropes to be broken. For many, the dungeon itself was the executioner. These stone chambers, damp and airless, were designed less for swift punishment than for erosion, a slow dismantling of body and mind that left captives hollow long before death claimed them. Cells were cut deep into the ground, where sunlight never reached. The air was wet and cold, carrying the stench of mold, urine, and unwashed bodies. Straw bedding quickly rotted into black sludge that clung to wounds. Chains fixed ankles to the wall so tightly that circulation failed, swelling limbs into grotesque shapes. Every breath tasted of stone dust and rot. For some, the dungeon was a sentence of weeks, for others of years. In every case, it was a sentence of decay. Hunger thinned bodies into skeletons draped in rags. Water came in foul trickles, green with slime, carrying sickness that twisted the gut. Rats emerged nightly, emboldened by the stillness. They nibbled at breadcrumbs, then at fingers, then at sores that never healed. Lice swarmed scalps until men scratched themselves raw, opening fresh wounds for infection. The dungeon turned every captive into carrion, while still alive. Darkness was worse than hunger. Without light, days dissolved into a timeless blur. Prisoners lost sense of when they slept or woke. Some whispered prayers constantly, repeating words like charms to hold back the silence. Others screamed for hours, only to collapse. Their voices cracked into silence again. The walls absorbed it all, cries, curses, prayers, until the air itself seemed to breathe with echoes. Guards passing by swore they heard voices long after prisoners had died, a chorus of whispers carried in the stone. Madness spread like fever. Men began to see shapes moving in the shadows, to hear footsteps where there were none. Some spoke to rats as companions, others to saints who never answered. A few clawed at the walls until their nails tore away, convinced there was a door hidden beyond the stone. Chroniclers tell of prisoners found sitting calmly in the dark, muttering to themselves, their eyes glazed as if already dead. For those above ground, the dungeon was invisible. The crowd saw executions in squares, but they never smelled the filth below. The silence of these chambers was the most terrible secret. Nothing public, nothing spectacular, only slow erosion that left no spectacle but bones. Yet the fear of being sent there was enough. The thought of endless dark, of rats chewing at wounds, of hunger that never ended, it kept mouths closed and rebellions quiet. The dungeon required no device, it was itself the device, a place where time, hunger, and silence became torture sharper than any blade. Here, death was not a moment, but a process, stretched until identity itself dissolved. In the silence of the dungeon, screams were not heard. They were swallowed whole, lost to stone that had consumed centuries of agony. When Europe stepped slowly into the Renaissance, the worst of the chambers began to close. Some devices were broken, others hidden away, yet their memory never faded. Chroniclers, travelers, and survivors carried the stories outward, of iron coffins, spiked chairs, rats in the dark, and dungeons where silence killed more surely than steel. These accounts spread farther than the chambers themselves, shaping Europe's image of its own cruelty. The stones remain, scattered in castles and ruins across the continent. Tourists walk through them today, rarely realizing what shadows those walls once held. But history remembers. The darkest secrets of the torture chambers were meant to stay hidden, yet they survived in whispers and chronicles, reminders that justice, when twisted, can become something worse than death itself. A theater of endless suffering buried beneath the floorboards of civilization.